Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let my voice take you back in time. Please like and subscribe. In the year 1491, in the royal palace of Greenwich, a child was born who would one day reshape England forever. His name was Henry, the second son of King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. At the time, few could have imagined that this vibrant, intelligent, and charming boy would become one of the most infamous monarchs in English history, a king who defied the Pope, married 6 times, and left behind a legacy of both greatness and destruction. This is the story of King Henry VIII, the man, the monarch, and the myth. Henry Tudor was never meant to be king. His elder brother, Prince Arthur, was the heir to the throne, groomed from birth to rule. Henry's role, instead, was to support his brother, to become a churchman or a soldier, depending on the crowness needs. But even as a child, Henry showed signs of ambition and brilliance. He was handsome, athletic, and gifted with languages. He spoke Latin and French fluently, played the lute, and excelled at jousting. Courtiers described him as a young Apollo, radiant and full of promise. His father, Henry VII, was cautious, a king who had seized the throne after years of civil war. Determined to secure his dynasty, he arranged a powerful alliance for his eldest son, a marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the mighty Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. But fate would intervene. In 1502, tragedy struck. Prince Arthur, barely 16, died suddenly, possibly of the sweating sickness. The Tudor court plunged into mourning. The young Henry, now the only surviving son, found himself the unexpected heir to the throne of England. The boy who had studied theology and poetry was now being groomed to rule. Yet Henry VII, ever cautious, held him tightly under control. The old king feared rebellion, and he feared his son's impetuous nature. It would not be until Henry VII's death in 1509 that the young prince would finally ascend the throne and unleash the full force of his personality upon England. The summer of 1509 was filled with celebration. At just 17 years old, Henry VIII was crowned alongside his bride, Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow. The marriage required a papal dispensation, as marrying a deceased brother's wife was forbidden by the church, but the Pope granted it, declaring the union lawful. To many, it seemed a divine match, a symbol of renewal after years of turmoil. London rejoiced. Chroniclers spoke of a golden age dawning. The new king was everything his people could have hoped for: young, strong, and charismatic. He embodied the ideal of Renaissance kingship, educated, cultured, and proud of his lineage. Henry adored tournaments and lavish displays. He spent freely on pageantry, building a court that dazzled with art, music, and beauty. His charm was magnetic. Ambassadors from across Europe wrote home about his confidence and vigor. But beneath the splendor, there was a restless energy. Henry was determined to prove himself not only as a monarch, but as a man destined for greatness. Henry's first ambition was to win glory on the battlefield. Like his hero Henry V, he longed to conquer France. In 1513, he launched his first campaign. The result was the Battle of the Spurs, a minor victory that Henry exaggerated into a triumph. At the same time, his queen, Catherine of Aragon, showed her own strength by defending England from a Scottish invasion. When King James IV of Scotland invaded, Catherine, acting as regent, ordered the English army north. The two forces met at Flodden Field, where the Scots were decisively defeated and their king slain. Henry returned from France to find his wife hailed as a heroine. For a moment, they seemed the perfect royal couple, admired, respected, and united by purpose. But one thing was missing: a male heir. Catherine bore Henry several children, but only one, a daughter named Mary, survived infancy. At first, Henry doted on both his wife and his daughter. But as years passed without a surviving son, doubt began to fester. In his eyes, a king without a male heir risked the chaos of civil war, the same turmoil his father had ended. Henry's frustration grew. He prayed, he blamed fate, and eventually he began to question whether God was punishing him. He remembered the words of Leviticus 20:21, which warned that a man who married his brother's widow would remain childless. Was his marriage cursed? As the years went on, Henry's attention began to drift. He still loved pageantry, hunting, and music, but he was increasingly drawn to younger women at court. And it was during this period that he would meet the woman who would change everything. Anne Boleyn arrived at court in the 1520s, having been educated in the sophisticated courts of France. She was clever, confident, and unlike any woman Henry had met before. Unlike others, Anne refused to become the king's mistress. She captivated him not with submission, but with her wit and intelligence. Henry was obsessed. He wrote her passionate letters, promising his love and fidelity. But Anne demanded marriage, not an affair. And so began Henry's desperate quest to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He argued that his union with Catherine had been invalid from the start, that her previous marriage to his brother made it unlawful in God's eyes. Catherine, however, refused to yield. She insisted she had been a virgin when she married Henry and remained the rightful queen. The matter escalated beyond England's borders. The Pope, caught between two powerful rulers, Henry of England and Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, refused to grant the annulment. Years dragged on. Court factions formed the Queen's party and the King's party. Henry grew more impatient and angry. It was during this time that his chief advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, once the most powerful man in England after the king himself, fell from grace. He had promised to secure the annulment, but when he failed, Henry accused him of treason. Wolsey died before he could be executed. By the late 1520s, Henry's obsession had become political and spiritual. If the Pope would not grant him a divorce, Henry would find another way. Advisors like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer began to suggest a radical idea, that the king himself was the supreme authority in his realm, not the Pope. The notion was revolutionary. For centuries, the English monarch had been subordinate to Rome in spiritual matters. Now, Henry was being told that his crown gave him divine power. In 1533, Henry took the ultimate step. He secretly married Anne Boleyn before his marriage to Catherine was annulled. When the Pope learned of this, he excommunicated Henry. But it was too late. The English Church had broken from Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. The Reformation had come to England not through theology or popular uprising, but through a king's determination to have his way. Henry's power was now absolute. But with that power came blood. Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, and in 1533 she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed. He had risked everything for a woman who, like Catherine, had given him only a girl. Still, he remained hopeful. But as the years passed and no son came, Anne's enemies grew bolder. Cromwell, the very man who had helped elevate her, turned against her when she challenged his policies. Rumours spread of Anne's temper, her arrogance, and eventually of adultery. In 1536, she was arrested and charged with treason, adultery, and even incest with her own brother. The evidence was thin, likely fabricated, but Henry was unmoved. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London by a French swordsman. She knelt before the block, praying softly, "I commend my soul to God." Henry, just days later, married again to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. In 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Prince Edward. At last, Henry had what he had long desired, a legitimate male heir. The court erupted in celebration. Henry wept with joy, declaring his new wife the saviour of the Tudor line. But tragedy soon followed. Jane fell ill from postnatal complications and died just 12 days after childbirth. Henry was devastated. For the rest of his life, he would call Jane his true wife. But the King's story was far from over. Over the next decade, he would marry 3 more times, each union shaping the course of England's destiny. His power would reach terrifying heights. His body would begin to fail him, and his once golden reign would descend into tyranny. This was only the beginning. When Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church, he did not just end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he shattered centuries of religious tradition. What had begun as a personal matter of the heart had now become a national and spiritual revolution. England would never be the same again. By 1534, Henry VIII stood at the height of his power. Parliament had declared him the supreme head of the Church of England, giving him unprecedented control over both church and state. Yet despite the monumental consequences of his actions, his motives were strikingly personal. He wanted a son. Anne Boleyn, now Queen of England, was the symbol of this new era, intelligent, ambitious, and unyielding. Henry had risked excommunication and rebellion for her, and now he expected his reward, a male heir to secure the Tudor line. In September of 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child. It was not the son Henry had hoped for, but a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry masked his disappointment, declaring that the next child would surely be a boy. Anne, meanwhile, threw herself into her role as queen. She was outspoken and politically active, supporting the cause of church reform and the distribution of English Bibles. Many admired her courage and wit, but others despised her arrogance. At court, enemies gathered. The old nobility, still loyal to Catherine of Aragon, considered Anne an upstart who had seduced their king into heresy. As months turned into years, Anne's relationship with Henry began to sour. She miscarried several times, and each loss deepened the king's frustration. His passion for her cooled, replaced by irritation and doubt. He had sacrificed everything, his reputation, his faith, and his alliance with Spain for this marriage. Now, it seemed, God still refused to give him a son. Anne sensed his waning affection. In public, she remained defiant, but in private, she grew desperate. Henry, ever susceptible to flattery and novelty, soon found his attention wandering again. Among Anne's ladies-in-waiting was a quiet, demure young woman named Jane Seymour. Jane was the opposite of Anne, gentle, obedient, and discreet. She offered Henry the calm admiration he craved. Anne saw the threat immediately. She quarrelled with Henry, accused Jane of seducing him, and even drove the girl from court for a time. But the king's heart had already shifted. By early 1536, Anne's position was fragile. Then fate struck another blow. That January, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. Though she had been exiled for years, her death sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Many saw it as the end of an era and the beginning of another. Henry wore yellow, the colour of joy, when he heard the news. But if he hoped this would ease his conscience, he was mistaken. Within months, Anne would be gone as well. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, a web of lies spun by her enemies, particularly Thomas Cromwell, the king's powerful minister. Cromwell and Anne had once been allies. He had helped secure Henry's divorce and engineered the break with Rome, but they had clashed over power and policy, especially over how church wealth should be used after the dissolution of the monasteries. Anne had mocked him publicly. Cromwell knew that to survive, he needed to destroy her. At her trial, the evidence was absurd. She was accused of committing adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The jury, terrified of displeasing the king, found her guilty. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London. She maintained her innocence until the very end. Her final words were calm and dignified. She prayed for the king, asking God to save him and send him long to reign over you. The same day, Henry dressed in white and celebrated his freedom. Within 11 days, he was engaged to Jane Seymour. Anne's death shocked Europe. Even those who had opposed her were stunned by Henry's coldness. The French ambassador remarked that the king had made an end of his second wife, as he did his first. Henry's ruthless resolve was now plain to all. Jane Seymour's marriage to Henry brought a brief calm to the turbulent court. She was modest, obedient, and wise enough to avoid politics. Henry adored her gentle nature, often referring to her as his true and perfect wife. Unlike her predecessors, Jane rarely argued with the king. Her only political act was a brave one. She once pleaded for the restoration of Princess Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, to the line of succession. Henry angrily reminded her to remember what happened to the last queen who meddled in his affairs. Jane never pressed the matter again. In October 1537, Jane fulfilled Henry's greatest wish. She gave birth to a healthy son, Prince Edward. At last, the Tudor line was secure. Henry was overwhelmed with joy, declaring days of national celebration. But the happiness was short-lived. Jane fell ill shortly after childbirth, likely from infection. 12 days later, she died. Henry was inconsolable. He ordered elaborate mourning ceremonies and later requested to be buried beside her. To him, Jane had been the perfect queen, the one who had given him the heir he had waited for more than 2 decades to have. But Henry was still a king, and a king could not remain a widower for long. By the late 1530s, Henry was aging and increasingly paranoid. Years of jousting and gluttony had taken their toll. He suffered from leg ulcers and had grown immensely overweight. Still, he was determined to remarry, partly for companionship, but also for political reasons. Europe had turned against him after his split with Rome. He needed new allies, and a new marriage could help secure one. Thomas Cromwell, always the pragmatist, arranged a match with Anne of Cleves, the sister of a German duke. The alliance was meant to strengthen ties with the Protestant states of Northern Europe. Before meeting her, Henry sent the painter, Hans Holbein, to capture her likeness. The portrait that returned to England was charming, a demure, fair-haired woman with kind eyes. Henry was pleased. But when Anne arrived in England in January 1540, the king was horrified. He found her unattractive and awkward, calling her a Flanders mare. The marriage was doomed before it began. Henry married her reluctantly, but the union was never consummated. Within 6 months, it was annulled. Surprisingly, Anne accepted her fate with grace. She agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and even remained in England as the king's beloved sister. Unlike so many others who crossed Henry, she lived out her days in comfort. But Cromwell, the man who had arranged the disastrous match, was not so lucky. Cromwell had been Henry's most loyal servant, the architect of the Reformation, the destroyer of monasteries, and the most feared man in England. But his enemies at court were many, and the failure of the Cleves marriage gave them the opening they needed. The Duke of Norfolk, a staunch Catholic and uncle to Anne Boleyn, led the attack. He introduced the king to his young, flirtatious niece, Catherine Howard. Henry was captivated. Catherine was barely 17, more than 30 years younger than the king, but her youth and beauty made him feel alive again. He showered her with gifts and affection, calling her his rose without a thorn. Cromwell's fate was sealed. He was arrested on charges of treason and heresy, and executed in July 1540, the same day Henry married Catherine Howard. The man who had helped make Henry supreme had been destroyed by the very system he created. At first, Henry was euphoric. Catherine Howard brought laughter and light to his court. She danced, sang, and seemed to adore him. The aging, ailing king was flattered and besotted. But beneath the surface, Catherine had a dangerous secret. Before her marriage, she'd been involved with several men, youthful indiscretions that, under Henry's rule, could become fatal. In 1541, rumours reached the king that the young queen had been unfaithful. At first, he refused to believe it. When the evidence was presented, he was devastated, then furious. Catherine was accused of adultery, an act of treason against the king. Her former lovers and confidants were executed, and she herself was imprisoned in the Tower of London. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. She was said to have asked for the execution block to be brought to her cell so she could practice placing her head upon it. She was barely 20 years old. Henry's grief was profound. For days, he shut himself away, emerging only to declare that he had been betrayed by love itself. He was now past 50, obese, and in constant pain. Yet even in his decline, he was still king, still feared, still obeyed, and still determined to shape his own destiny. In 1543, Henry married for the 6th and final time. His new wife, Catherine Parr, was a widow twice over intelligent, mature, and deeply pious. She was not chosen for beauty or politics, but for companionship. Henry was old, ill, and increasingly paranoid. Catherine offered him comfort and stability. Yet she was more than a nurse. She was a reformer at heart, sympathetic to Protestant ideas. She encouraged Henry to reconcile with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and she helped restore them to the line of succession after Prince Edward. Under her influence, Henry's court briefly softened. She organized his household, oversaw his education reforms, and even acted as regent when he left for war in France in 1544. But her intelligence nearly cost her life. Conservative factions at court accused her of heresy, claiming she had criticized the Catholic faith. Henry, ever suspicious, signed a warrant for her arrest. When Catherine learned of this, she acted swiftly. She threw herself at the king's feet, declaring that her only wish had been to distract him from his pain through religious discussion. Henry, moved, or perhaps embarrassed, forgave her. The warrant was quietly destroyed. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, the only one of his 6 wives to do so. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was a shadow of his former self. The once athletic king was now grotesquely obese, unable to walk without assistance. His legs were ulcerated and foul-smelling, his temper uncontrollable. He had grown paranoid, seeing betrayal in every corner of his court. Ministers, nobles, even close friends were executed on suspicion of treason. The man who had once embodied Renaissance glory had become a tyrant, yet despite his cruelty, his authority remained absolute. He continued to wage wars in France and Scotland, draining his treasury and exhausting his people. But perhaps his greatest war was within himself, between the man he had been and the monster he had become. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. In his final moments, he spoke little. When asked if he wished to confess, he murmured, "I trust in the mercy of Christ." He was buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his long-desired son. His death marked the end of an era, but not of the legacy he had created. Prince Edward, only 9 years old, became King Edward VI. The boy was frail, but deeply Protestant, and under his short reign, England moved further away from Catholicism. After Edward's death, Henry's daughter Mary briefly restored Catholicism, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. But when she too died childless, Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter ascended the throne. It was Elizabeth who would stabilize the realm, end the religious wars, and usher in the golden age of the English Renaissance. In a strange twist of fate, the daughter Henry once dismissed as useless would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Henry VIII's reign transformed England forever. He was a man of contradictions, charismatic yet cruel, pious yet power-hungry, visionary yet destructive. His 6 marriages were not merely personal dramas. They were the engines of political and religious change. From Catherine of Aragon came the spark of defiance that led to the English Reformation. From Anne Boleyn came Elizabeth, the future queen who would secure England's greatness. From Jane Seymour came Edward, the heir who embodied Henry's lifelong obsession. From Anne of Cleves came peace and a rare moment of grace. From Catherine Howard came tragedy, a reminder of the king's human weakness. And from Catherine Parr came redemption and reconciliation. Each wife, in her own way, shaped the destiny of England. Henry VIII left behind more than just a fractured church and a line of monarchs. He left behind a nation transformed, one that had learned to challenge authority, question tradition, and redefine power. He was the king who defied the world for love, and in doing so, remade it. When King Henry VIII entered the last decade of his reign, the brilliant prince who had once dazzled Europe was gone. In his place stood an aging monarch, swollen by power, haunted by regret, and trapped in a decaying body. He had ruled for more than 3 decades. He had outlived 4 wives, executed 2, and broken an empire of faith. But even as his strength failed, his determination to control his kingdom and his legacy burned as fiercely as ever. By 1540, Henry VIII was a man transformed, and not for the better. The handsome, athletic king of his youth had become grossly overweight. Decades of rich food, drink, and injury had left him in constant pain. A severe jousting accident years earlier had shattered his leg. The wound never fully healed. Ulcers oozed and festered, sometimes so badly that courtiers could smell the king before they saw him. He could barely walk without aid, and yet he refused to be seen as weak. He surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants who told him what he wished to hear. His temper, always fierce, had grown uncontrollable. Even the highest nobles trembled before his wrath. Still, Henry clung to the image of the glorious Renaissance monarch he once was: strong, learned, and chosen by God. He refused to admit that his health, his policies, and his kingdom were all beginning to crumble. Paranoia became the hallmark of Henry's later years. The Reformation he had unleashed had splintered the nation. Protestant and Catholic factions vied for dominance, each claiming to serve the true faith and the true will of the king. Henry played both sides masterfully. One day he would burn Protestant reformers as heretics. The next he would execute Catholic loyalists as traitors. No one felt safe. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest advisors. He had destroyed his greatest ministers: Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, each at the height of their power. Now, with Cromwell gone, Henry ruled more directly than ever. But the kingdom was restless. The suppression of monasteries had stripped away the social fabric that once bound England's poor. In 1536, when the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in the north, a massive rebellion against Henry's religious reforms, the king was momentarily shaken. He promised mercy, only to execute the leaders later in a brutal display of vengeance. His power was total, but his trust was gone. The English Reformation, born of Henry's desire for a son, had now taken on a life of its own. The monasteries, once centers of learning, charity, and faith, had been dismantled. Their lands were seized, their treasures looted, their monks and nuns cast out. Henry justified it as purification, freeing the church from corruption. But in truth, it was also about money. The dissolution of the monasteries filled the royal coffers and enriched Henry's allies. For centuries, England's faith had been Roman Catholic. Now it was something new, something uncertain: the Church of England, loyal not to the Pope, but to the King. Yet even Henry himself could not fully decide what that meant. He still believed in many Catholic traditions: the Mass, confession, and the celibacy of priests. But he rejected papal authority and allowed the Bible to be printed in English. He called himself a reformer, but he was also a destroyer. To the common people, the change was bewildering. To his enemies abroad, it was blasphemy. To Henry, it was destiny. Even as his body failed him, Henry's appetite for war never diminished. In 1544, more than 3 decades after his first campaign, he once again declared war on France. It was a desperate attempt to relive his youth, to prove that he was still the warrior king, the new Henry V. He personally led an army across the Channel, though his health made it impossible to fight. His troops captured Boulogne, a modest victory that Henry trumpeted as a triumph. But the war was costly, draining England's finances and achieving little. His rivals, the French and the Holy Roman Emperor, mocked his vanity. By 1546, England was exhausted. Henry's once great treasury was nearly empty, and the glory he had sought was reduced to propaganda and ceremony. Yet he would not admit defeat. To the very end, he clung to the illusion of strength. Henry's legacy was not only political or religious, it was deeply personal. His 6 marriages had reshaped the English monarchy and left a complex web of heirs and loyalties. His son, Prince Edward, now a growing boy, was the center of his universe. Henry adored him, though his physical condition often kept them apart. Edward was intelligent, serious, and deeply Protestant traits encouraged by his tutors and advisors. Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had both been declared illegitimate at various times, victims of their father's shifting affections and political convenience. Yet as he grew older, Henry seemed to regret his cruelty. Under the influence of his final wife, Catherine Parr, he sought reconciliation. Both Mary and Elizabeth were restored to the line of succession by Act of Parliament. It was a remarkable gesture, one that would ultimately shape the future of England. Catherine Parr's gentle diplomacy helped heal some of the wounds Henry had inflicted, but even she lived under the constant threat of his temper. Catherine Parr was unlike any of Henry's previous wives. She was older, wiser, and skilled in the art of survival. She had no illusions about her husband's nature. She knew the stories, the beheadings, the betrayals, the executions, and yet she navigated life at court with extraordinary tact. Catherine was deeply religious, favouring Protestant reforms, but careful never to challenge Henry's authority directly. She encouraged learning and debate within her household, even inviting the young Elizabeth to study theology and philosophy. For a brief time, Henry seemed content. Catherine gave him comfort and stability. She oversaw the education of his children and managed the royal household efficiently. But peace at Henry's court was always fragile. Conservative factions, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, feared Catherine's reformist influence. They accused her of spreading heresy. Henry, susceptible to intrigue, signed a warrant for her arrest. When Catherine learned of it, she acted swiftly. She went to the king and confessed that her religious discussions had never been meant to contradict him, only to ease his suffering and divert his mind from the pain of his infirmities. Henry, touched, or perhaps embarrassed, forgave her. When the soldiers came to arrest her, he greeted them with fury, declaring that his wife was a good woman. Catherine Parr had done what few others could. She had survived Henry VIII. By the winter of 1546, the king's health had deteriorated beyond recovery. He could no longer walk without assistance. His ulcers caused unbearable pain. His once sharp mind was clouded by age and medication. Yet even from his sickbed, he ruled with an iron will. He continued to sign death warrants, including that of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, the brilliant and arrogant poet, accused of treason. Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, narrowly escaped execution only because the king died before the order could be carried out. Henry spent his final months at Whitehall Palace, attended by a small circle of loyal servants and courtiers. He refused to discuss death, though he knew it was near. When his chaplains asked if he wished to receive the sacrament, he said only, "I believe in the mercy of Christ." In the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII breathed his last. He was 55 years old. According to some accounts, his final words were a whispered prayer. Monks, 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 perhaps a final echo of guilt for the monasteries he had destroyed. His body was placed in a massive coffin and carried to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where he was buried beside Jane Seymour, the wife he had called his true queen. Henry VIII left behind a kingdom both greater and more divided than he had found it. His son, Edward VI, inherited the throne at the age of 9. The boy was bright and devout, but too young to rule. The realm was governed by regents' men who pushed England further toward Protestant reform. Edward's reign was short. He died at just 15, leaving no heir. In the chaos that followed, Henry's elder daughter Mary took the throne. Determined to restore Catholicism, she reversed many of her father's reforms and executed hundreds of Protestants. History would remember her as Bloody Mary. When Mary died childless in 1558, the crown passed to Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, with Anne Boleyn, the child whose birth had once caused such disappointment. Elizabeth would reign for 45 years, guiding England into an age of prosperity, exploration, and artistic brilliance. Under her rule, the nation Henry had torn apart began to heal. In a sense, it was Elizabeth who fulfilled the promise Henry had dreamed of, the greatness of the Tudor dynasty. To understand Henry VIII is to confront contradiction. He was a man of immense charm, wit, and intelligence, a true Renaissance prince who loved music, art, and learning. He was fluent in multiple languages, a skilled athlete, and an accomplished composer. Yet he was also vain, ruthless, and insatiable in his pursuit of power. His reign was a paradox, both creative and destructive, enlightened and barbaric. He built the foundations of modern England, a centralized monarchy, a national church, and a sense of English identity distinct from Rome. But he also ruled through fear, destroying anyone who stood in his way, including some of the most brilliant minds of his age. To his subjects, he was both hero and tyrant. To his wives, he was both lover and executioner. And to history, he remains one of the most compelling figures ever to wear a crown. Each of Henry's 6 wives played a vital role in shaping the man and the myth of Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon, the proud Spanish princess who stood firm in the face of humiliation. Her dignity and faith set the stage for the Reformation that would divide England. Anne Boleyn, the bold and brilliant woman who captured the king's heart and defied convention. Her fall was tragic, but her daughter, Elizabeth, would become one of the greatest monarchs in history. Jane Seymour, the quiet and gentle queen who finally gave Henry his son and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves, the diplomatic bride whose failed marriage spared her from the king's wrath. She alone found peace and friendship in her separation. Catherine Howard, the youthful beauty whose passion brought joy to an aging king and whose recklessness led to her death. Catherine Parr, the wise and patient widow who tamed the tyrant, reunited his family, and survived him. Each of them was a reflection of Henry himself, his desires, his insecurities, and his relentless pursuit of control. Henry VIII's impact on England cannot be overstated. He began his reign as the embodiment of hope, a golden prince destined to lead his nation into peace and prosperity. He ended it as a tyrant, feared by his people and surrounded by the ghosts of those he had destroyed. Yet out of his ambition and cruelty came transformation. The Church of England, born from his defiance, became one of the pillars of the British state. His navy, once small and neglected, grew under his reign into a formidable force that would later command the seas, and his children Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth would each, in their own way, define what it meant to rule England. Henry VIII did not simply reign over a kingdom. He remade it in his image, flawed, magnificent, and utterly human. More than 5 centuries have passed since Henry VIII's death, yet his shadow still looms large. His story has inspired countless books, plays, and films. His image, broad-shouldered, red-bearded, and glowering beneath a crown, remains one of the most recognizable in the world. To some, he is the symbol of absolute monarchy, the king who dared to put his will above that of the Pope, the Church, and even God. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a man consumed by desire, pride, and paranoia, whose pursuit of power destroyed nearly everything he touched. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Henry VIII was, above all, human, brilliant and brutal, visionary and vain. His reign was not merely a story of kings and queens, but a story of transformation of faith, identity, and the birth of the modern world. And so, in the echo of history, his words still linger. I am King of England. My will is law.